You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. John 8 verse 32. What if I told you that the God of the Old Testament, Yahweh, wasn't the good guy? What if I told you that the figure millions worship as the Almighty Creator was actually a malevolent entity, a tyrant posing as God, the devil in disguise? This isn't some edgy theory or clickbait nonsense. I'm talking about contradictions, shocking verses, and ancient texts buried, burned, or silenced for over 1,000 years. Texts that tell a story so dark, so unexpected, it might make you question everything you thought you knew. In the Old Testament, Yahweh, the so-called God of love, orders genocide, blood sacrifices, and destruction on a level we'd call evil if it came from anyone else. Take Exodus 32 verses 27 to 28, for instance. After the golden calf incident, Yahweh tells Moses, "Go back and slaughter your own people. Brothers, neighbors, friends, it doesn't matter. Kill them all." 3,000 people were butchered, not by outsiders, but by their own. Then there's Numbers 31:17-18. Yahweh commands the Israelites to destroy the Midianites, saying, "Kill every man, every woman, and every child, except for the virgins. Keep them for yourselves." Let that sink in. Yahweh not only orders genocide, he spares young girls for the soldiers to take. And don't forget 1 Samuel 15 verse 3, where Yahweh says, "Now go and strike Amalek. Kill men, women, children, babies, cattle, and sheep." Babies. Innocent lives wiped out by divine decree. Now stop and ask yourself, if Yahweh is truly the God of love, mercy, and justice, why does he act like a vengeful warlord? Why does he demand the blood of innocents? And most importantly, why does no one question this? It turns out, someone did. In the 2nd century AD, a group called the Gnostics, early followers of Jesus, began asking these same questions. And their answer was shocking. Yahweh is not the true God. Yahweh is the demiurge. The demiurge, according to the Gnostics, is a false god, a jealous and malevolent entity who created this broken, material world as a prison for our souls. The true God, they believed, is not Yahweh at all, but a being of pure light and love who exists beyond the physical universe. The Gnostic text, the Apocryphon of John, reveals Yahweh's true nature. It quotes him saying, "I am God, and there is no other." But the Gnostics saw this as a lie, an act of arrogance. Yahweh wasn't the ultimate being, he was a fraud, a jailer, a tyrant posing as God to enslave humanity. Now here's where it gets even more disturbing. Jesus himself hinted at this truth. In John 8 verse 44, Jesus tells the Pharisees, religious leaders who followed Yahweh's law, "You are of your father, the devil." Think about it. Jesus wasn't just insulting them. He was pointing at something far bigger. While Yahweh demanded blood, Jesus preached love and mercy. While Yahweh called for war, Jesus taught forgiveness. Their messages couldn't be more different. And early Christians noticed. They believed Yahweh was the deceiver, the ruler of this fallen world, the devil in disguise. The church calls these ideas heresy. They burned the Gnostic texts, wiped out their followers, and buried their truths. But we live in a different time now. These writings have resurfaced. The contradictions are clear. And the question they raise is impossible to ignore. If Yahweh's actions look like those of a tyrant, demanding blood, spreading fear, punishing disobedience, then is he truly God? Or is he something else entirely? Early Christians wrestled with this question, and their answers were so dangerous that they were silenced for centuries. But today, their voices are back. The texts are out there. The truth is waiting. There's a reason you've never heard this before. It's because they buried it. Literally. The Gnostics, the earliest Christians who dared to question Yahweh, had their teachings wiped from history, labeled as heresy, and burned to ash. But the truth, it didn't disappear. It just went underground. In the 2nd century, something massive happened in early Christianity. A split. On one side, you had the mainstream church, those who accepted Yahweh as the ultimate God and pushed his rules as the truth. On the other, there were the Gnostics, a radical group who looked at Yahweh and said, "Wait a second, this doesn't add up." And what they discovered? It was dangerous enough to shake the very foundation of religion. The Gnostics believed that Yahweh wasn't God at all, but the demiurge, a lesser, flawed being who created the material world, not as a gift to humanity, but as a prison. Think about that. The entire physical world we live in, every breath we take, every struggle, every bit of suffering, all of it, a trap. Designed to enslave our souls, to keep us from reaching the true God. Now, where did this idea come from? It wasn't random. The Gnostics weren't lunatics making stuff up. They were reading the same scriptures you read today. But they didn't stop there, they also had access to other texts that the church later buried. Take the Apocryphon of John, for example. This is one of the most revealing Gnostic texts ever found, discovered in a jar buried deep in the sands of Egypt in 1945. In it, Yahweh is exposed as a jealous, arrogant entity. He declares, "I am God, and there is no other." But according to the Gnostics, this wasn't the voice of the ultimate creator. This was the voice of a liar, a being so deluded by his own power that he tricked humanity into worshipping him. Now, here's the kicker, this arrogance wasn't unique to Yahweh. The Gnostics compared him to other gods and kings of the ancient world. Think about it. Every tyrant in history, the warlords, the emperors, what's the first thing they do when they seize power? They demand worship. They insist they're divine. To the Gnostics, Yahweh wasn't the God of all creation. He was just another tyrant, one with enough power to create, yes, but still imperfect, flawed, and driven by jealousy. Sound familiar? You've read about that jealousy in the Old Testament, haven't you? A God who says, "You shall worship no other gods, for I, the Lord, am a jealous God." Exodus 34 verse 14. But the Gnostics took it one step further. They claimed Yahweh didn't want humanity to know the truth. The truth that we're not meant to be slaves, we're not supposed to live trapped in his flawed, physical world. In fact, they believed Yahweh's greatest crime was keeping humanity ignorant of its own divine potential. Here's where it gets wild. The Gnostics believed that a spark of the true God, the real creator, exists inside each of us. Call it a soul, a divine light, whatever you want. And Yahweh? He did everything in his power to keep that spark from igniting. That's why the Gnostics called him the ruler of darkness, the jailer, the deceiver. Now think about the Garden of Eden. In the mainstream story, Yahweh forbids Adam and Eve from eating the fruit of knowledge. He tells them, if you eat it, you will surely die. But here's the plot twist. The Gnostics believed the serpent in the garden, the one Christians have been taught to fear, wasn't evil at all. The serpent was the liberator. The one who told humanity the truth, eat this, and your eyes will be opened. You will become like gods. And what happened? Adam and Eve didn't die. They woke up. They saw the truth. And Yahweh? He punished them. For the Gnostics, this story wasn't about a sinful fall, it was about an escape attempt. Humanity's first glimpse of the prison they were trapped in. It's no wonder the church wanted this buried. If Yahweh wasn't the loving creator but a tyrant, then everything changes. Worship becomes submission. Faith becomes enslavement. And suddenly, the Gnostics' message, that Yahweh is the deceiver, and the real God is still out there, becomes the most dangerous idea in history. The Gnostics didn't just believe this. They lived it. They rejected Yahweh's laws, his commandments, his world. And for that, they were hunted. Their writings destroyed. Their voices silenced. If you were introduced to Yahweh's actions in the Old Testament without context, without knowing he was supposed to be God, what would you think? Would you see a loving father, or would you see something darker? Let's stop sugarcoating this. The Yahweh of the Old Testament isn't a gentle shepherd watching over his flock. He's vengeful, violent, and obsessed with control, traits that would make any reasonable person question his intentions. But instead of asking, we've been conditioned to accept it as divine justice. Take a closer look, and you'll see a pattern. A pattern of a being who doesn't guide humanity with love, but rules with fear and blood. A being who demands obedience and punishes rebellion with unrelenting cruelty. Genesis 6, the flood. Humanity disappoints Yahweh. So what does he do? He decides to wipe the slate clean. Not with a lesson. Not with mercy. With mass extinction. He drowns the entire planet, men, women, children, everyone. Imagine the screams. The terror. Entire families clawing to stay alive as the waters rise. And for what? Because Yahweh decided humanity wasn't living up to his standards. This wasn't correction. It was annihilation. Leviticus 10, Nadab and Abihu. 2 priests, the sons of Aaron, offered strange fire in Yahweh's temple. What's their punishment? Death by divine fire. No second chances, no warnings, just instant obliteration. Think about this. 2 men, likely trying to serve the same God they were raised to revere, made one misstep, and Yahweh burned them alive. 2 Samuel 6, Uzzah. Uzzah sees the Ark of the Covenant, Yahweh's holy artifact, about to fall. Acting on instinct, he reaches out to steady it. His reward? Yahweh strikes him dead on the spot. Let that sink in. A man dies for trying to protect something holy. This isn't love. This isn't compassion. This is a God who values power over people, obedience over understanding. And yet, we're told to revere him without question. Now look at Yahweh's relationship with his chosen people. You'd think he'd be protective, nurturing, like a father. But no. Yahweh demands absolute loyalty. And when the Israelites falter, he unleashes brutal punishment. Numbers 14, the wandering. The Israelites, exhausted and afraid, question Yahweh after hearing reports of giants in the Promised Land. Their crime? Doubting him. Their punishment? Wandering in the desert for 40 years, until an entire generation dies off. He makes them pay with their lives, simply for being afraid. And then there's Yahweh's obsession with blood sacrifice. Animal blood. Human blood. From the near sacrifice of Isaac in Genesis 22 to the countless lambs, bulls, and doves slaughtered in his name, Yahweh seems to crave it. He demands it constantly, whether for forgiveness, for favor, or just to appease him. In Exodus 12, he even orchestrates the killing of Egyptian firstborns, innocent children, as part of his wrathful plan to prove a point to Pharaoh. Now, let's stop pretending this is normal. These aren't the actions of a benevolent creator. This is the behavior of someone, or something, that thrives on control, punishment, and fear. The Yahweh of the Old Testament doesn't sound like a loving God. He sounds like a jealous king. A dictator. A tyrant. And this isn't an accident. These stories aren't misunderstood or mistranslated. They are written plainly, boldly, in the very text we've been told is holy. The early Christians, the Gnostics, saw Yahweh's actions for what they were, proof that he wasn't the true God. They believed Yahweh was a false god, a demiurge, who ruled not with love, but with iron-fisted dominance over a broken, physical world. Now here's where things get chilling. If Yahweh was powerful enough to create this world, to demand worship, to punish rebellion, then who, or what, was he really? The Gnostics believed he was a being consumed by arrogance and pride. A being who wanted to be God but could never truly be divine. Look back at Yahweh's own words in Isaiah 45 verse 5, I am the Lord, and there is no other. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? It's the cry of a ruler desperate to establish his authority, terrified of being questioned. So I'll ask you this, if a king ruled your land the way Yahweh ruled his people, killing those who disobey, punishing those who doubt, and demanding sacrifice after sacrifice, would you call him a just king? Or would you call him a tyrant? For centuries, Christianity has been built on the idea that Jesus and Yahweh are one and the same, that the God of the Old Testament is the Father Jesus speaks of. But if you pay attention to what Jesus actually says and does, you'll notice something shocking. He doesn't act like Yahweh. He doesn't sound like Yahweh. And most importantly, He challenges Yahweh's entire system. Look at the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5. Jesus says, "You have heard it said, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also." Stop right there. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth, where does that come from? Yahweh. That's his law. It's straight out of the Old Testament, Exodus 21 verse 24, a law of vengeance, punishment, and equal harm. But Jesus? He rejects it completely. He replaces it with something Yahweh never taught: mercy, forgiveness, radical love. This isn't just Jesus clarifying the old laws. This is him dismantling them. Line by line. Command by command. He's not following Yahweh's rules, he's overturning them. And it doesn't stop there. In John 8 verses 3 to 11, when a group of Pharisees brings a woman caught in adultery to Jesus, they cite Yahweh's law. The law of Moses commands us to stone such women, they say. And they're right. Leviticus 20 verse 10 says she should die. That's Yahweh speaking. That's his rule. But Jesus? He doesn't obey it. Instead, he bends down, writes in the sand, and says, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." And one by one, the accusers leave. Jesus looks at the woman and says, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." Think about that. Jesus ignores Yahweh's law entirely. The punishment Yahweh demanded, gone. The blood Yahweh craved, denied. Jesus doesn't just save the woman, he exposes the cruelty of Yahweh's laws and reveals a different path. And here's where it gets even more intense. In John 8 verse 44, Jesus says to the Pharisees, "Men who upheld Yahweh's laws, you are of your father, the devil." Let that sink in. The Pharisees were Yahweh's most loyal followers. They enforced his commandments. They lived by his laws. And Jesus looks them in the eye and calls them children of the devil. He doesn't say this lightly. He's drawing a line. He's showing us that Yahweh's system, built on fear, punishment, and blood, is not from the true God. It's from something else entirely. And here's the question nobody wants to ask: if Jesus came to reveal the true God, then who exactly was Yahweh? Because Jesus' Father doesn't demand sacrifices. He doesn't command genocide. He doesn't drown the world in anger. Jesus' Father is described as light, as love, as spirit. But Yahweh? He's a jealous ruler, a warlord, a being who says in Deuteronomy 32 verse 39, "I put to death and I bring to life. I wound and I heal." That's not the God Jesus points to. Even the way Jesus speaks about the Father is different. In John 18 verse 36, Jesus says, "My kingdom is not of this world." Yahweh's kingdom is this world. He created it, ruled over it, and demanded worship from its inhabitants. But Jesus? He points beyond it, to something higher, something purer. This tension between Jesus and Yahweh isn't a coincidence. The early Gnostic Christians saw it too. To them, Jesus wasn't sent by Yahweh, he was sent to rescue humanity from Yahweh. He was the liberator, sent to free us from the demiurge's grip. And when you read the New Testament with that in mind, suddenly everything makes sense. Jesus' message isn't about obeying Yahweh's laws, it's about escaping them. It's about rejecting the world Yahweh created and reconnecting with the true God, the one beyond this broken reality. But here's the real question: if Jesus wasn't serving Yahweh, then why have we been told for centuries that he was? Why have these contradictions been brushed aside, hidden under layers of doctrine and tradition? The answer is simple. The truth is dangerous. The truth upends everything we've been taught about God, about faith, about this world. What if I told you Judas wasn't a traitor, but a chosen disciple on a secret mission? What if his so-called betrayal was the key to freeing Jesus and humanity from the grip of Yahweh? It's one of the most misunderstood stories in the entire Bible. Judas Iscariot, the man who betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, condemned for all eternity as the ultimate villain. But what if I told you the story of Judas isn't what you've been taught? What if Judas wasn't acting out of greed or malice, but following orders from Jesus himself? This isn't a wild conspiracy. It's written in an ancient text that the church buried for centuries, the Gospel of Judas. Discovered in the Egyptian desert in the 1970s and finally brought to light decades later, this gospel flips everything you think you know about Judas and about Jesus on its head. In it, Judas isn't the betrayer. He's the only disciple who truly understood Jesus' mission. While the others were blinded by their earthly perceptions, clinging to Yahweh's flawed creation, Judas saw through the illusion. Let me read you something chilling straight from the text. In the Gospel of Judas, Jesus tells Judas, "You will exceed all of them. For you will sacrifice the man that clothes me." What does that mean? It means Jesus chose Judas for a purpose. Judas wasn't turning against him, he was helping him. The man that clothes me refers to Jesus' physical body, his human form. To the Gnostics, the physical body was a prison, crafted by the demiurge, Yahweh, to trap the divine spark within us. Jesus wasn't here to save the body. He was here to escape it. To shatter the chains of the material world and return to the true God. But to do that, he needed someone to hand him over to death. Someone who understood that his crucifixion wasn't a failure, it was the ultimate liberation. And Judas, he was the only one Jesus could trust with that truth. Let that sink in. The man we've been taught to hate for 2,000 years, the man who betrayed the Jesus, was actually following orders. He wasn't a villain. He was the hero of the story. Think about it, in the traditional version of events, Judas' action set the crucifixion in motion. But without the crucifixion, there's no resurrection. Without the resurrection, there's no salvation. Judas didn't doom Jesus, he fulfilled his mission. So why does the church vilify Judas? Why erase the gospel that tells this story? Because it exposes the cracks in their narrative. If Judas was chosen, if the crucifixion was part of a greater plan to escape Yahweh's control, then it destroys the idea that Yahweh's world is holy. It challenges the foundation of a faith built on Yahweh's authority. Here's where it gets even darker. The Gospel of Judas reveals that Jesus knew the disciples were worshipping the wrong God. In one of the most damning moments, Jesus laughs at the disciples when he catches them praying to Yahweh. He tells them, "You are praying to your God. You do not know who you are." To Jesus, the disciples were still lost. They couldn't see beyond Yahweh's illusion. They were worshipping the creator of the physical world, not the true God of light and spirit. Only Judas, the outcast, the traitor, was able to see through the lie. And that makes you wonder, who's really been betrayed here? Jesus? Or us? For centuries, the church has clung to a version of the story that makes Judas the villain and Yahweh the hero. But the Gospel of Judas forces us to ask questions they don't want us to ask. Was the crucifixion a tragedy or a victory? Did Jesus come to save the world, or to free us from it? And if Judas was his most trusted disciple, what does that say about everything we've been taught? The truth is, the Gospel of Judas wasn't destroyed because it was false. It was buried because it was dangerous. It told a story where Yahweh's grip on humanity was broken, where the chains of the physical world were shattered, and where the ultimate act of betrayal was actually an act of love. History is written by the victors. And when it comes to religion, the victors were ruthless. They chose what you see, what you read, and what you believe. But they couldn't erase everything. Hidden texts, lost scrolls, and banned gospels still survive, and they tell a story the church doesn't want you to hear. The Bible we have today isn't the whole story. It's the edited version. Carefully curated. Sanitized. But what happened when we look at the texts they rejected? Texts found buried in the deserts of Egypt, sealed away in forgotten caves, or parsed quietly among outcast sects. What happens when we dig into the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Nag Hammadi Library, and the texts of early Christian mystics? Here's what we find: a world of belief that's completely different from what mainstream Christianity has told you for centuries. A world where Yahweh isn't the all-loving God, but something far more sinister. Let's start with the Dead Sea Scrolls, ancient Jewish manuscripts discovered in Qumran in the 1940s. Among these scrolls, we find an unsettling portrait of Yahweh. In one text known as the War Scroll, Yahweh is depicted as a god of vengeance, commanding his followers to slaughter their enemies in the war of the sons of light against the sons of darkness. It describes divine-led battles, bloodshed, and destruction as Yahweh demands absolute dominance. This wasn't a spiritual god. This was a warrior king. The War Scroll strips away any illusion of love or mercy and reveals Yahweh as a being consumed with power and violence, just like the Gnostics warned. Then there's the Nag Hammadi Library, a collection of ancient texts discovered in 1945, written by early Christians who questioned Yahweh's true identity. One of the most fascinating texts is the Hypostasis of the Archons, which goes deeper into the creation story than Genesis ever did. According to this text, the world wasn't created by a benevolent God. It was created by the Archons, lesser rulers led by a jealous and corrupt being with a demiurge. Sound familiar? The demiurge is none other than Yahweh. But here's the twist: the true God didn't create this broken world. He exists beyond it. His pure light and spirit, completely separate from the material prison Yahweh crafted. This explains why Yahweh acts the way he does in the Old Testament. He's not all-powerful or all-loving. He's a flawed creator, desperate to be worshipped. The Archons, the rulers under him, keep humanity blind, trapped in a cycle of ignorance and suffering. And guess what? Early Christian mystics saw this too. The church tried to erase their voices, but their writing survived in whispers and fragments. The 2nd century Christian philosopher Marcion of Sinope was one of the first to call out Yahweh for who he really was. Marcion argued that Yahweh, the God of the Old Testament, was not the same as the Father Jesus preached. To Marcion, Yahweh was a lesser God, a tyrant who ruled through law and punishment, while the true God was a God of love, revealed only through Jesus Christ. Marcion's teaching spread like wildfire, and for a moment, the church couldn't stop it. People began to question the Bible. They started to see the contradictions. But then, the church declared Marcion a heretic, burned his writings, and stamped out his movement. This is how history works. Voices that challenge the narrative are erased. Manuscripts that tell the truth are buried. But sometimes, they survive. And when they do, they reveal a disturbing pattern: Yahweh's actions match the description of the demiurge. A being who traps humanity in a material world, demands obedience, and punishes anyone who questions him. Look at the mythologies of other ancient cultures. The Babylonians had Marduk, a jealous and vengeful god of creation and war. The Canaanites worshipped Baal, another god who demanded sacrifice and total submission. The similarities are eerie. It's as if Yahweh isn't unique at all, but just another version of the same old tyrannical gods worshipped across the ancient Near East. And yet, we've been told for centuries that Yahweh is the one true God. Why? Because those in power decided it was so. They buried the texts that questioned him. They erased the voices that told a different story. But the evidence is still there if you're willing to look. By now, the pieces are starting to fall into place. Yahweh's actions, his violence, jealousy, and obsession with control, don't line up with the nature of a loving, all-powerful creator. Early Christians saw through it. The Gnostics exposed it. The lost texts confirmed it. Yahweh wasn't God, he was the demiurge, a lesser being who created this physical world as a prison. The Gnostics believed that a divine spark, a fragment of a true God, exists within each of us. They called it the light, the eternal part of our being that Yahweh can't control. It's the part of you that feels restless, that feels trapped, that knows, deep down, that something about this world doesn't make sense. The demiurge, Yahweh, he crafted the physical realm to trap that spark, to blind us, to keep us focused on material things, fear, survival, wealth, power, anything to keep us from realizing the truth. This is why Yahweh demanded worship. This is why he punished rebellion. Because if humanity ever woke up, if we ever saw through the illusion, his power would vanish. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Jesus didn't come to save us in the way the church teaches. He didn't come to fix Yahweh's broken world. He came to show us how to escape it. To reveal the true God, a being of light, love, and spirit that exists beyond this corrupted creation. In the Gospel of Thomas, one of the texts discovered in the Nag Hammadi library, Jesus says, "If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you." What is it within you? That spark. That divine light. That piece of the true God that Yahweh tried to bury. The Gnostics believed that salvation wasn't about obeying laws, worshipping a jealous God, or waiting for the end of the world. It was about knowledge, gnosis, the realization of who you really are. Yahweh wants you to think you're small, powerless, and sinful. That you need him. But Jesus came to show you the opposite, that you're divine, eternal, and connected to something greater. This changes everything. The Gnostics were telling us that the true God isn't a ruler or a judge. He doesn't demand sacrifice. He doesn't punish or condemn. The true God is light, and he wants you to awaken. To see Yahweh for what he is, a fraud. A deceiver. A jailer. And that's why the church tried so hard to silence this message. Because a world where people know the truth is a world where Yahweh loses his grip. A world where fear, guilt, and control no longer work. So, here we are. 2,000 years later, holding the fragments of a forgotten truth. The pieces of a puzzle that the victors of history tried to destroy. But now you know. The texts are out there. The voices of the Gnostics are rising again. And the question remains, what will you do with this knowledge? Maybe this video shakes you. Maybe it makes you question everything you've been taught. That's good. Questions are how we break free. Questions are how we wake up. Because here's the truth, the light is within you. It always has been. And the first step toward freedom is seeing the prison for what it really is. Thank you for watching. If you made it this far, I want to say I appreciate you for keeping an open mind and being part of this conversation. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If this video challenged you, share it. If it opened your eyes, spread it. And if you're hungry for more, don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.